Okay, this is a bit too complex to type out. It's just easier for me to do it with video. So, what prevents humanity from achieving utopia? That can actually be described very easily. 2 words: greed, apathy. That's literally the problem mankind faces. Now, explaining that is a bit more complex. First, the natural state of mankind once we develop civilization, meaning after the caveman era. The natural state of mankind. It's important to understand what that means. That means what we tend to always be is monarchy. Now, when I say monarchy, I may or may not be using the right word, but basically single point rulers. So monarchs, kings, queens, dictators, military commanders, etc., single point leaders. Now, usually we end up with multiple single point leaders, or oligarchy, but that is only because the oligarchs are individual monarchs who have developed enough power that they can't immediately kill each other. So they tolerate each other until such time as they think they might be able to kill each other, which is why we have wars. I think I'm bigger than that monarch. Maybe I can kill him and take his land, and I'll have more. And then once I have more, I can kill the next one. So we are always striving toward monarchy. That is the natural default state of human species. Now, when I say human species, I'm talking about the species as a whole, because individually, we are more like a mixture of capitalism, socialism, communism, anarchy. We basically just want to be left alone. That's where apathy comes in. So there's always some of us who strive for leadership positions, and then there are those who strive just a little bit more. They want to be more than leaders. They want power. And those are who become the gang members and police officers and high-end criminals, and beyond that they go into politics, and or they become lawyers, they become politicians, they become government people, monarchs, kings, queens, dictators, etc. So all of those different positions are the limit of power that they're able to achieve. So when I tell people is that power does not corrupt, that's a fictitious statement, because power can't do anything. It's a non-corporeal, non-sentient, non-sapient thing. It doesn't have the ability to make a choice. It's just power. Corruption seeks power. Now, corruption obviously can't do anything either, any more than power can. So when I say corruption, I'm talking about people who are corrupt, people who seek power, who seek positions of authority. They will seek the highest position of authority they can get. So the gang leader, that's the highest position he was able to get within his power structure. The other gang leader becomes president of the United States, or a billionaire or whatever. And of course, there's 2 sides to that as well. Like I said, power doesn't corrupt. So you can have a perfectly good person become a billionaire, or it's pretty hard for a good person to become a billionaire. That's actually pretty hard. You can walk into it, stepping on the footprints of people before you, or you can get lucky. It's less likely for a good person to be a billionaire. If you look at the mechanics of what it takes to be a billionaire, you can have good billionaires, but it's less probable. Because you have to do a lot of bad things to be a billionaire. We don't see them as bad. They don't see them as bad, but they are. They're detrimental to society as a whole. The reality is billionaires shouldn't exist. It theoretically should be impossible for them to exist unless they rig the game. And, well, they rig the game. So, greed is the problem, and apathy is why we can't fix the problem. Benjamin Franklin was quoted when we created the Constitution, when we ratified the Constitution. A lady, asked him, "What have you done?" And this is an approximate quote. I could be off by a word or two, but the gist of the meaning is here. Benjamin Franklin is quoted as saying, "We have given you a republic for so long as you can keep it." He was talking about the core problems of achieving utopia. He was talking about humanity's core Achilles heels, greed and apathy. Greed is always going to cause people to strive to seek more power, and apathy in the general population is what causes the a society to crumble and allow those people to get that power. When we stop caring, when we stop involving ourselves in the process, they can take more and more power. They can consolidate more and more power. That's why you see the federal government getting stronger and stronger and stronger as we pass laws and repeal laws to allow more power to be concentrated in fewer and fewer people's hands. For the last 100 years, we have created a second state, just like we did in the past with the church. The church was the state. They were in competition with the government. Sometimes they were the government. So you have two state entities. You have the religious state and you have the political state. That would be the church and the government. Well, we've neutered the church today by having a separation of church and state for our country, although those walls are breaking down now too. For example, under God should not be in the Pledge of Allegiance. That was illegally added in World War II in our fight against, or actually I think after World War II, 50s, 56 I think. It was in our fight against communism during the Cold War. We added the under God to the Pledge of Allegiance, which should not be there. Because our government is supposed to have a separation of church and state to avoid exactly that problem of a religious state forming again to create the problems that we had when we had state churches in the past. It's not anti-religion, it's anti-religion in power. Religion belongs in your church and your home, not in our society. Respected, but not adopted. Separation of church and state. So the greed and apathy is the core problem here. How to fix it? Boy, that's complicated. The one path most likely available to us to solve this problem. You ever watch Star Trek? Star Trek is basically a socialist utopia. Oddly enough, socialism is probably the ideal form of government for human beings, but not today. I would not want to live in a socialist government today, and sadly, we are. The United States is a largely socialist government. It's just socialist for the wealthy, not for us. We have corporate welfare. I mean, literally, most of our tax money goes to corporations, and it's not direct. And we're not handing a check to the corporations, but we are de facto handing over our tax money to the corporations by not taxing them, which is how they've been able to accrue, I think the top 1/10 of 1%. So not the top 1%, the top 1/10 of 1%. So 0.1% of the population owns 94% of the nation's wealth, or 90%. Well, they own more of the wealth than the bottom 90% of the country. Because those numbers might actually be different. And, that kind of a wealth distribution is not possible unless the game's rigged. In a game with a fair playing field and a free market, that's impossible. You can't accrue that kind of wealth. You just can't do it, except by force. Either violent force or legislative force. And legislative force is a violent force because it's backed up by the monopoly of violence that the government holds. So it's by de facto violence. The threat of violence. If you resist us, the government will come after you, kind of thing. So the violence is there. It's just, nobody resists it because we know what's going to happen. Stop it. Get your nails off me. Cat likes digging his claws at me when he wants attention. So, there he is. Hi, kitty. The solution, we kind of have to have what Star Trek has, and we are a long way away from that. These things are a start. These things right here. But those are the most primitive concept of what we need. What we need is three things. Two of them are technological, and one of them is societal. We need matter replication, and we need unlimited free energy. We have to have those two technologies. Without those two technologies, it can't work. Because the only way to fix this greed apathy problem is we need to be a post-need society. A post-need society is a society where nobody needs anything. Everybody can have whatever they need. To reach that state, we need matter replication and unlimited cheap energy, or virtually free energy. Because without it, there is always going to be need. And if there is need, then people have to work for those needs, and those people need to be rewarded for that work, or society is not going to work very well. Meaning we need to be at a point where we no longer need money. And the only way to have a moneyless society, a truly moneyless society, not no more dollars and we're using credits, no currency whatsoever. The only way to do that is to have a post-need society. And the only way to have a post-need society is to have matter replicators and unlimited, cheap, or nearly free energy. It has to be basically free. When we have that, when we have unlimited energy, effectively, when I say unlimited, I don't mean actual unlimited. I mean more energy than we could use. When we have that state of energy and matter replicators, we will be at a post-need state in society. There will still be want, but there won't be need. Then we could switch to a socialist-style government, and it could actually work. But we need that third thing, because the reason socialism cannot work today, the reason communism can't work, the reason capitalism is failing, it already failed. Capitalism failed 50 years ago. We're not a capitalist country. We are a imperialist plutocracy. We are not capitalist. China has more capitalism than the U.S. does. What we call capitalism today is not capitalism. It's not, because the state owns the means of production for profit, not the people. Because the definition of capitalism says other than the state. And the corporations are the corporate state. They have legislative authority. They can pass legislation. They can affect government decree. Therefore, they are not the people. They are not privately owned. They are the corporate state. They are a state. We need to alter the very nature of human beings. That's the third thing that we need. That comes with education, which is why the United States has one of the worst education systems on the planet. Because the people in power realize that a stupid population is an easy to manipulate and control population. Just look at the mask fiasco of the last year, which should have been a simple, scientific, obvious thing with 100 years of established scientific fact backing it, has become one of the largest political agenda points of our generation. If an alien culture visited our planet and saw the mask tobacco with this mask tobacco, is that the right word? I don't think it sounds wrong. I think I'm saying that wrong. But the fiasco, the mask fiasco surrounding this pandemic, the aliens would look at the virus and look at the human state of technology, and they would go, "What the fuck is wrong with these people? Are they like retarded on a genetic level?" But you saw what happened. Anyway, we would have to improve education to the point where the general population has a general education good enough to allow them to see through the noise to the signal, and to recognize the difference between signal and noise, fact and fiction, and bullshit and not bullshit. So we would either need to modify our genetic code to remove the greed aspect of it, which I don't think is possible, and if it was, I don't think it would be a good idea, because I think there's going to be side effects to doing that, because greed is not intrinsically bad. Greed is drive, pride, and desire to progress that has gone to a bad extent. So it's where someone who has desires and visions for a better future, and they have the drive to want to achieve and accomplish, it's when that goes too far. Greed is when you take that too far to an unhealthy extent. So it's like, I love you, you're a wonderful person. I love you, you're a wonderful person, you can never leave me, and you squish and you crush the person under your love. That's gone to a bad, like the difference between love and lust. So greed is the bad end result of going too far with drive and passion and achievement. Greed is when you've gone to an unhealthy extent, like lust. So we don't need to remove it. We need to temper it. And if we can't temper it, we need the rest of the population to be educated enough to call it out for the bullshit it is. And that's where we fail. That's why we have a poor education system on purpose. We intentionally have a poor education system in order to keep the population stupid, and the population in general. I mean, look, when they try to pass laws that are good for the people and half of the general population who would benefit from that law fights against it. They are literally fighting against their own well-being, supporting people who are not going to help them. when you have half the population putting a noose around their own neck and going, "Hey, this feels great," you've got a problem. There's just something wrong with those people on both sides. It's just they're both just taking a different path to the same end result. The hyperpolarization that goes along with that de-education allows for a very easy to deceive and manipulate and control population, and that's what we're doing on purpose. So we would need to improve the education level of the general population to the point where our society as a whole can go, "Are you stupid? You sound like a madman. Why would you even say such a thing?" and be able to call these people out on the bullshit as it comes out, regardless of what official they are. When we achieve that, combined with post-need society, well, then we can start talking about utopias. Until then, we live in a society where we have needs, and those needs have to be paid for by somebody. As long as we live in that society, well, we have to work with things like capitalism. Capitalism is not bad. Capitalism is just another form of socialism and communism. Believe it or not, socialism, communism, and capitalism are three things that are actually pretty similar. If you look up their definitions, they're not that different. They're all actually attempts to do the same thing. They are all created by people who recognize that our society has a default status of monarchy, which is bad for the general population as a whole. And they are attempts to create a fair playing field. Not an equal playing field, but a fair playing field, a fair distribution of power. All three are designed to achieve that. I personally don't think communism is even possible. At least the way people have described communism to me, it's not possible for our species. I mean, you would have to eliminate individuality. I mean, if you could make people into literal drones like bees, then you could have something like communism. So I don't think that ideal, I don't think is possible, nor do I think it's desirable. I like my individuality. I like the fact that I'm not the same as everybody else, that I can actually think. As a drone, you would not realize you can't think because you would be a drone. Socialism's Achilles' heel is greed. Capitalism attempted to temper the greed Achilles' heel with wealth. So if individuals had wealth, the idea was that they would fight to retain that wealth. The problem is, once an individual acquires enough wealth, they can begin to influence government, meaning you create a second state. Once you do that, then the individual's wealth no longer becomes relevant, meaning even if they have wealth, they don't have power, because the more wealthy are usurping power via control of government. And that's the Achilles heel of capitalism. That Achilles heel is, once again, what did I say in the beginning? 2 words. Greed, that's what's causing them to usurp the power of government, and apathy, the people not standing up and going, "Hey, no, you're not supposed to do that," because ultimately we have the power. There's 330 million of us versus them. The problem is we're not organized, and they have the ability to prevent us from becoming organized. I mean, like it or hate it, look at what they did to things like Parler and stuff like that. I mean, I logged into Parler once. That place is that place is full of wackos. I'm sorry if any of my friends are in there, but what I saw in there was whack jobs. I mean, they've taken positions that I hold and that I agree with, and they've gone off the deep end with them. Just like the people on this side have taken their positions and gone off the deep end with them. It's like greed. You've taken what is normally not a bad thing, and you've just taken it to an extreme that's not healthy. And that's what I see there. But those voices are being silenced. And if they can silence those organized voices, silencing you is not hard. And so because they have an established power of a position of authority, and because they have a monopoly on violence, they can interrupt any attempt to build competition toward them, because they'll just call it whatever they want to call it and make it a crime. Or simply take away your ability to fund it. That's why, certain things in media become defunded. You're not allowed to be monetized if you're allowed at all. And without monetization, you can't build a power base. And without a power base, you cannot challenge the established power. So if you can control the money, you can control the power. That's the kind of society that we've created. So, I don't know. How do you wake everybody up and educate them behind the scenes without the established power knowing and intercepting and preventing you from doing it? I don't know how to do that. As far as I know, the only solution is violence. And if you look at history, you'll see that no established power, we're talking about national level powers here, not little powers. Like, we have a problem with power in our town right now. The mayor was out of control, and well, we're taking care of that. 300% of who voted at the last election came out and voted to change our form of government to a commission manager form to get rid of the mayor. And they fought tooth and nail to stop it, and are still fighting tooth and nail to stop it, because they want to keep their power. And on a small scale, you can affect this kind of change. But on a national scale, an established power does not give up that power without violence. Ever. There is no recorded instance of history of an established power giving up power without violence. Now, keep in mind, most people don't actually understand what violence is. Violence is the application, use, or threat of force. So if I bash you over the head, that's violence. If I threaten to bash you over the head, that's violence. If you think I'm going to bash you over the head and I encourage you to think that, that's violence. So a classic example people give is, protesting. Well, protesting has never worked. Never. I stand corrected. There are times where protests appear to work, but that's because you have two established powers that are opposed to each other but not related. So this government and this government of two separate countries, and then the people protest against this government, and then this government supports the protesters in its effort to usurp this government. So in reality, that's not a protest. That is, they are an army for this government, and they just don't even know it. And that's what happened with Arab Spring, by the way. You might say, well, what about Muhammad Gandhi? Well, that was violence. People say, but he's the definition of peace. No, he's not. He's the definition of non-physical violence. What he used was the threat of force, which is violence. He had a sufficiently large number of followers that the threat of force that his followers represented was large enough to compel the party he was against to take action. So, for example, this would be like when you see a large enough group of protesters stand up to a small police force and the police force backs down. Even though nobody's fired a gun and nobody's hit anybody, the police back down. Well, they back down because there's an overwhelming threat of force, the people standing in front of them who are clearly willing to exert violence, and the police recognize this, and therefore the police back off. Because they recognize that if we permit this threat of force to escalate to actual force, we're going to lose. So they back off until they can establish a large enough set of force on their own to overwhelm the threat of force by the people. Well, that's what happened with Gandhi. His followers represented a threat of force that the government could not win against. At least they didn't think they could win against. Therefore, they negotiated. But in all of history, there is no example of an established authority giving up their authority without violence, without either the application of force or the threat of force. And the counter problem to this is that the general population is not organized, and the established authority prevents them from organizing by simply making any attempts to organize illegal, or convincing the media and the population that that attempt to organize is, a bad actor, an enemy, and therefore the population turns against them. So it's very difficult for us to get a foothold against establishment like that, who exert their authority. Typically, the only time people revolt is when they are starving. A good way to describe this, I'll give you an example. I walk into a bank and I spray the ceiling with bullets with my MAC-10 machine gun and say, "This is a robbery, everybody down." Well, you're standing next to Carl, and Carl says, "Hey, buddy, let's rush him. He can't get us all." What happens? Nothing happens. You see, humans tend to take the path of least resistance, the path that has the highest probability of survival. That's a natural instinct, and it's a very logical one. I mean, if you were to stand up against the government, what would happen? A jackbooted thug with a black boot would put his boot on your neck, and that would be the end of you. They would either throw you in a jail cell or destroy you politically or in your community well enough to ruin your life, and then you would no longer be a threat. That's what happens when you become a legitimate threat. So if you were to attempt to rush me, I would just shoot you with my machine gun, and you would die. And now everybody else would be far less likely to try to rush me because none of them want to die. Now let me flip the scenario. Okay? Same thing. I spray the ceiling with bullets and say, "Everybody down, I'm robbing you." Carl tells you, "Let's rush him. He can't get us all." Freeze time. You all recognize me. I'm infamous. I've robbed like 20 banks so far. And I have an SOP, a modus operandi, that I use every single time I rob a bank, all 20 times without exception. When I'm done robbing a bank, I personally put a bullet in every single person's head. 100% casualty. Everybody dies. Now what happens when Carl says, "Let's rush him"? Well, the reality is you're going to die anyway, but I'll explain that. That's a twist of humanity. But in this hypothetical experiment, you all rush me. Because now I'm going to get some of you. Yes, I'm going to get some of you. But if you don't rush me, I'm going to get all of you. So now rushing me actually increases your odds of survival. So on a side note, just because this is hilarious to me, why would you all die anyway? Because some of you scumbags are going to hold back to try to increase your odds even further of survival, and that's just going to give me the time to kill you all. But you see my point. The point is, a people do not revolt until the alternative to revolting is worse. Meaning until the population is starving and the population in general is dying. Then and only then will a people revolt. Because now they're in that second bank robber scenario where they can not revolt and die, or they can revolt and probably die, but some of us are going to live, and maybe I'll be one of the ones that live. And so that's the only time people revolt, is when they're in that die if I don't, maybe die if I do. Okay, now let's do it. That's the only time they do it. And of course, because they are uneducated and because they are prevented from organizing, the revolt is very nasty, very dirty, and very bloody. The one exception to this in all of human history that I'm aware of is the United States, of all places. We are the exception, and that exception can never exist again. Maybe one day when we are an interplanetary society, but we still have difficulty getting from planet to planet or system to system, maybe that set of circumstances can exist again. But even then, well, I can think of ways around that. KKV. If we can go from star to star, we can launch a KKV, and that'll take out an entire planet. But anyway, let's assume we don't have that. In the creation of the United States, we had a very unique situation of socioeconomics and geography and technology that will never exist again. We were separated by an ocean that we could barely cross. The fatality rate was sometimes as high as 50% for ships crossing the ocean. It was pretty bad. We barely had the technology to cross oceans. And on top of that, The people that came here to the colonies were unusually educated and privileged, meaning they tended to be relatively wealthy and relatively educated because they were coming here for religious freedom, to escape religious persecution. It's part of why we had a very strong church upbringing, and it's also part of why we instituted the separation of church and state. That's exactly why we did that, because we just escaped that church hell from over there. And on top of that, we had become established here and entrenched. We had the homeland advantage. They had no supply train from their home bases except to cross an ocean we could barely technologically cross. We didn't win the War of Independence. We did not win the Revolutionary War. We did not beat the British back and the British says, okay, we're defeated, you win. No, that's not how that happened. The British said, fuck it, you can have it. Take it. We give up. We don't want it anymore. It's yours now. They gave up because they were bleeding money and people trying to win it because they were separated by an ocean. So we didn't defeat them. They got fed up with how much it was costing and said, fuck it, keep it. It's yours. Ultimately, that's what happened. But that set of conditions doesn't exist anymore. Do you know how much of the population was involved in the Revolutionary War? 13 colonies. How many of the people were involved in that? 3%. 3%. So those set of conditions don't exist anymore and never will exist again. So most societies, well, they last about 2 generations, maybe 3, before they begin to fail. And the reason they begin to fail is the people get lazy. They get apathy. They get, what do you call it? When you take for granted what exists. There's a word for that. I can't remember the word. But life was good here. No, don't get me wrong. It wasn't good for everybody. You know, talk to slaves from 1800s and ask them how good it was. But in general, for the bulk of the white population, life was halfway decent and not bad. And so we stopped paying attention to the people in charge. And so that's when they started to accumulate power. You know, just a little law here or there, just a little change here or there, and slowly the government gets more and more powerful, more and more laws, and as time goes on. Now, of course, that's kind of like an exponential graph, so it starts off very shallow, but then towards the end it goes zip. Well, we're up here. That's why we're seeing such drastic and dramatic effects over the last couple of years, is because we're reaching the expo part of that exponential push. And we're seeing the culmination of the last couple of 100 years of meandering, twisting, and manipulation of our politics and our society in general. The reduction of education, the impoverishment of the entire population. I tell people that we are in a state what I call the wealthy poor. I am a ridiculously poor individual. I make about $600 a month, and because of a lucky circumstance selling a business that allowed me to buy this house, I have a Core i7 laptop sitting here. I have a 65-inch screen sitting here. I have 150 3D printers. You know, I have some really nice camera gear sitting here. You know, it's because I'm very careful what I spend my money on. But this right here is a $400 lens. We're in a state of the wealthy poor. We are very, very poor and don't realize it because we are artificially decreasing the costs of certain parts of society to allow people to have something of a life, to prevent people from starving. Now, when I say prevent people from starving, I'm not talking about prevent starvation. Remember, the entire population has to be starving. The whole bank is going to be murdered if they don't rush me. Not just these 5 people, all of us. So when all of us are in a position of starving, that's when we'll revolt. And so we manipulate our society to prevent that. The problem is some of these things are out of their control, and it's backfiring on them. For example, the Great Recession, 1929, something like that. Most people don't realize that was caused intentionally. The recession was an intentional act that got out of control. You see, these people are not stupid. Contrary to what people think, these people at the top are not idiots. They may sometimes act like idiots, but that's because they're working on a different playing field than we are. And they have to say things that are oxymoronic from their playing field to our playing field that seem stupid, but they're not once you understand where they're coming from. Well, these people back in the 1920s realized that our currency was on an exponential curve. And they were, on this curve, and they were about here. And they thought, is there anything that because they could see that eventually this curve was going to go infinite, and that's when the system was going to fail. They could see it coming. They're not idiots. They can do math. So they wondered, could we take an action to bump us back down the curve, cause a little controlled crash, and then work up, crash it again, work up, crash it again, keep us from hitting that expo point. So what caused the 1929 crash is probably going to eventually happen anyway, but in this particular instance, they actually instigated it. They actually made a decision that caused it. How do you stop a run on a bank? Well, it's easy. You give everybody every dollar they want. You truck money in by whatever means is necessary, and you give everybody what they want. And if you give everybody what they want, eventually they calm down and they realize, okay, my money's not at risk. The bank is going to give me my money. And people calm down. Because a rush on a bank is an instinctive reaction. Get what I can before it's gone. So if you can convince them that it's not gone, that we will protect your money, that there is no risk, people will calm down and the bank run will stop. These high-end bankers, however, decided they wanted to try to control a crash to see if they can bump us back down that expo curve. So I think it was Sunbank, I don't remember the name. But anyway, they called up and said, we need cash, we have a bank run. They said, no. That one word caused the Great Depression. Because our markets were already worldwide, they had become they're not sapient, but they've become a living organism of sorts. Our monetary system had become so complex and interconnected and interactive with itself, almost like a living organism, that we were no longer able to input such a type of control and predict what was going to actually happen. And the cascade reaction that happened as a result of that one word, no, was far beyond anything they could have predicted. They did not realize it was going to cause so much damage, or they probably wouldn't have done it. They're stupid. They're very smart. They're evil. They're nasty, but they're not stupid. They wouldn't have done it if they knew it was going to do that. They thought they can control it. They thought they could, segregate that response and just bump us back down that curve just a little bit. But we had already become too complex. Our monetary system had already become global and had already become far too complex for them to be able to input a control like that. Such a crude control caused the crash. That's why they haven't tried to do that again. Because now it's even more complex and it would just destroy everything. How to fix it? I don't know. I really don't know how to fix it. Ultimately, the first thing we need to do is start educating people. The problem is that's going to take a generation or two. And remember, the established power is going to resist that aggressively. They've spent 200 years destroying our education system. So they're going to resist it very, very heavily. But we have to educate people. And as we begin to educate people, we can begin to affect change. We're going to have to institute practices that I don't like. For example, I think one of the only ways we're going to be able to fix this is with a universal basic income. We're going to have to give everybody a monthly paycheck, no matter what, whether they work or not. Because we are in a state where we are going to start running out of jobs, and we are continuing to increase the number of people on the planet. And the cost of living is continuing to go up. So I don't like UBI because UBI could very quickly become slavery. It's very easy to manipulate a population who absolutely needs you for their income. So UBI can be a force for good, or it can very, very easily be a force for evil. But it might be necessary because we have huge resistance to increasing the minimum wage. And the only way to give people power is to give them the ability to choose to work. When working is not a voluntary interaction, it's an involuntary interaction. You don't have a choice. Saying you have a choice to work is saying that when I come up to you, stronger and faster than you, with a gun and put it to your head in a dark alley and say, give me your wallet, and you saying you have a choice, you can say no, yes, and you can live for about 4 seconds as you watch your brain matter splatter on the wall behind you after I pull the trigger. Sure, that's a choice. Technically, it is a choice. It's not a voluntary one, because there are dire consequences to saying no. So you are coerced to say yes. That's the reason I put a gun to your head, to cause you to say yes and not resist me and say no. So unless you have a counter for that force, you got to say yes or you die. Working is not voluntary, because we live in a society that, for the general masses on average, no exceptions, and we're not counting people who can make exceptions, okay? In general, for typical people in general across the country, you have a choice: work or die. Or at the minimum, lose everything. So it's not a voluntary interaction. You don't have a choice. You have to work. So when someone offers you a job that underpays you, you can't simply say no and go get a different job, because the other job is going to offer to underpay you as well. That's what a lot of people live under, those conditions. 50% of the entire population lives on $30,000 a year or less. Or is it 40%? It's 40 or 50% of the population lives on $30,000 a year or less, which means 40 or 50% of the population lives on minimum wage or less. Don't believe me? The normal full-time work year is 2,000 hours. Well, if you take 2,000 hours and divide that into $30,000, that's $15 an hour, minimum wage or less. Okay? So almost half the country lives in that state. There's 160 million working Americans. That means 70 to 80 million of them are living on minimum wage or less. I think somebody said 60% of all new jobs are minimum wage jobs. So you don't really have a choice. And so you have to take the work, even if it's an underpaid job, because you have to work to live. And even though that work cannot provide you with sufficient income, you then have to use cheat codes in order to survive. The first cheat code people use is they forego health care because they can't afford it. The second cheat code people use is they forego housing and they choose to get a roommate or rent a room, which is not a state we should exist in. But we do it because we have to. And then the next cheat code we enable is we work 2 or 3 jobs. So that's where you get a person working full-time at McDonald's and Uber on the side. Even though ultimately it costs them money in the long run, it allows them to survive for now. The only way to fix that is to put people into a position where they can say no. Where if you offer me an underpaid job, I can say, no thanks, that's not enough. That's not a living wage. I don't need your job. UBI would allow us to do that. UBI would give people the power to say no. Because with UBI and using the cheat codes on top of that, for example, roommates, we can survive. It wouldn't be a great survival. It sucks shit, but we can survive. And if a job wanted us to work for underpay, we could say no. If a job wanted us to do something that was illegal or immoral, we can say no, because it is now a voluntary interaction. We have a choice. This causes a secondary problem. The reason we suppress wages so much, this comes back to control. The reason we suppress wages is to prevent wage inflation. Wages are not a factor of supply and demand. They are a factor of artificial restriction of supply and high demand. We do this by suppressing wages, which forces people to work multiple jobs. I was working 3 full-time jobs at one point. If you look at that from my position, then that means I am taking, at minimum, 2 jobs that 2 other people could have had. If you only need to work full-time, I'm taking enough positions that 5 other people could have worked if I didn't need to take all those positions. If we were to actually pay a living wage, to pay a proper minimum wage like we're supposed to, by the way, that is exactly what minimum wage is created for, to be a living wage. It was supposed to be a living wage. It was never supposed to be for starter jobs. Again, 50% of the country is living effectively on minimum wage or less. Just how many 16-year-old high schoolers do you think there are in this country? Trust me, there's not 80 million of them. That's a delusional state that people have. That's the propaganda that they've been brainwashed to believe and regurgitate out, parrot out. If we had a living wage, for example, I could work I'm self-employed, first of all, so minimum wage does not affect me at all. I have no skin in this game. So it's not like I'm trying to benefit myself by saying this. My income is not even decided by minimum wage. So before you think I'm just trying to get free money, if you made minimum wage $15 an hour, it would have no effect on me whatsoever. My income would not change at all. By having a living wage, people would not need to work multiple jobs. Therefore, more jobs would become available. By having a living wage combined with cheat codes, for example, minimum wage would allow a person, I'm going to say me just because it's easier, but a person to pay for housing. Now, minimum living wage has to be combined with universal health care, because even $15 an hour is not a living wage. It would need to be like $24 an hour. And that would allow you to afford, a house or apartment and health care and your basic living expenses. $15 won't do that anywhere in the whole country. Even in the lowest income portion of Mississippi, that's not enough. But anyway, I could then say, okay, you know something? If you and I split a house or an apartment, we could almost double our income. Because now, instead of each of us paying $1,200 for rent, we would be paying $600 each for rent. So that's an extra $600 we could put in savings, which would allow us to, first of all, get out of rent and go buy a house, for example, or improve our life and move to a better location where there are more jobs, because moving is actually very expensive. It's extremely difficult to just pick up and move somewhere else. It costs a lot of money. My move, not including the fact that I bought a house, cost me $6,000. $4,000 of that just in fuel. Okay? That pickup truck and that school bus took a lot of gas at 6 miles to the gallon. And it was $2,100, and hotels and food, and when you combine all together, moving is really hard. This would allow us to save up and allow us to improve our status in life. Right now, we have to use those cheat codes just to survive. They don't benefit us. We just use them to survive our underpaid wages. So this would allow people to improve their position, improve their income, which would reduce the demand on jobs even more. Because there are places where some people, after they've improved their position and, for example, bought a cheap house, now they don't even need full-time anymore. They can survive on, especially if they're sharing with a roommate, they can survive on a part-time job. They might only need to work 20 hours a week. Well, that frees up even more positions for people to work. Unemployment would drop to zero. Now, when I say unemployment, I'm not counting people with mental health conditions, homeless that are mentally have problems, because they're going to be homeless whether there's a job available or not. So we're ignoring that aspect of the problem for now. We're talking about people able and capable of working. That unemployment level would drop to zero. Guess what happens when you do that? Guess what happens when you reach a state where there are more jobs than people? Wages go up on their own. There will be no $15 an hour jobs. They'll all be $20 an hour jobs, $22 an hour jobs. Do you know why? Because now I don't need you. You need me. And when you need me, we now have a negotiation. Now you have to, my life is okay. It's not great, but it's okay. I don't need to work 40 hours a week. But now, in order to fill their job positions and convince me, a person who does not need that job, to go to work, they have to make it worth my while. They have to increase the offer to overcome my lack of need, to entice me with a want. Oh, wait a minute. $20 an hour? Hey, $15 an hour job. See you later. I'm going to work for them for $20. And now that job has to increase their wage in order to entice somebody to work for them. That's what they're afraid of. They're deathly afraid of that because they know that's exactly what would happen. As our lives improved and we did not have to slave away 40 hours a week for $8 or $9 an hour and not even be able to survive on that without massive cheat codes, basically literally a slave economy. It's literally a slave economy that we operate under. Is it plantation black people slavery? No, but it's still slavery. It's just a different form of it. In fact, it's even more nefarious. At least the black person on the cotton plantation knows they're a slave. We have a population where half of the people are slaves, they don't know it, and they fight to continue it. It's just like... I mean... But that's why they suppress wages. They suppress wages to prevent us from getting to that equilibrium point where wages actually have to reflect a desire to work. Universal basic income would help us get there. And as we continue to automate, it's going to be necessary. See, in theory, as we automated, profits should go up, wealth should go up, productivity goes up, income and wages go up, and people need to work less and less hours. And therefore, instead of one person working 40 hours, you can have 4 people working 10 hours each, or 2 people working 20, or 4 people working 10. Because eventually, once you automate enough and you reduce costs enough, that would be enough for a person to live on. And that's what they want to prevent, because that would not allow them to squirrel away 94% of the nation's wealth into 0.1% of the population. They wouldn't be able to do that anymore. And you know what really sucks? If wealth distribution was properly handled in this country, if people actually got what their income, if they got an income that was worthy of their work, people were paid fairly, and we all had decent, relatively nice lives, they would still be filthy fucking rich. But it's not enough for them. It's not enough. What did I say originally? 2 words. Greed and apathy. That's the core thing preventing us from achieving a utopia. We could have something pretty close to a utopia today. We have the technological means and the societal infrastructure to do it. Life is not fair. Anytime I hear a person say life is not fair, I just want to start breaking their knuckles on their fingers, one by one, and say, hey, life's not fair. Because it's no longer a case of, nature killing us and stuff like that in general. Of course, there are things that can kill people, lightning bolt, whatever, but those are exceptions. Most of our disparity and fairness in our society today is an artificial construct. It's something we choose to do upon ourselves that we could choose not to do. We could make our society much more fair. We just have to choose to do it. It's not natural. It's a choice. And we need to choose. What's the proper choice? The proper choice is not Republican or Democrat. The proper choice is to take the good aspects of the Republicans and the good aspects of the Democrats and put them together and say, do this. We need universal health care. We need a aggressively regulated and maintained free market. We need taxes to be disproportionately toward the wealthy where it belongs. We need to stop taxing the lower incomes into poverty, literally into poverty. The average person making minimum wage is paying 30 to 40% of everything they make in taxes. And even before taxes, they don't make enough to live on. You might say, you're insane. No, I'm not. First of all, you're automatically paying 9.86% of everything you pay into taxes as soon as you earn $1, because that goes to Social Security, Medicare, and payroll taxes. Then you're paying, depending on what state you live in, you're paying 3 to 5% to your state for income tax. And in some places, like where I was in Levittown, you're paying 2.5% to your local and your county governments in income tax. And that's before you got your paycheck. That's before you even cashed it. Then you have DMV taxes, sales taxes, property taxes, school taxes, utility taxes, gas taxes, road taxes such as bridge tolls and turnpikes and stuff like that. You have all these taxes. When you add up all these taxes in an average person's life, year, it's 30 to 40% of every dollar they make going to taxes. And that's not even including the indirect taxes they pay. The taxes built into the purchase of a product. Not the sales tax tacked onto it, but the taxes Canon paid and FedEx paid and the store paid. Everybody whose hands this went through, they all paid taxes. Well, guess who pays those taxes? You do. Businesses don't pay taxes. I ran a business. I never paid one dime in taxes. Never, ever have I ever paid a dime in business taxes. My customers pay the taxes. Not me. My customers pay the taxes. I incorporate the cost of those taxes in my profit and loss on the stuff that I sell. When I sell that 15-inch dildo for $60, $30 of it is taxes. I didn't pay that. You did. You bought the product, you paid the tax. Ultimately, the only people who pay taxes, for the most part, obviously there's exceptions here, for the most part, the only people who pay taxes are those who can't pass the taxes on to someone else as a cost. So, the reason your house costs $200,000 is taxes and banks. The reason your car costs $30,000 is taxes and banks. The reason milk costs $4 a gallon is taxes and banks. If you adjusted for all of that, it'd be a lot less. But the nice thing about indirect taxes, when done correctly, is you can control indirect taxes. You can choose not to buy this if the taxes are too high. I as a business, this is a write-off for me. This is a business expense. I need this to earn my income. So the taxes are just a cost of doing business for me, but you as a personal user can't write off those taxes. You have to eat them. If we switch to indirect taxation, that would fix a lot of our problems. I got a whole separate set of videos on indirect taxation. This video is 57 freaking minutes long. Holy shit. Well, if you made it to the end, congratulations. You are Iron Man. So, it's like I said, it's an easy answer and a complicated solution. It's an interesting intellectual discussion. Let's leave it at that. 57 minutes.